Hey, can you hear me in the back? All right, okay. Hey, even thumbs up at the door. All right, awesome. But it's great to be here. It's just a privilege to be invited to be the Lumen lecturer tonight, and on a topic that's about something that I'm very passionate about. So I figured I'd start out by talking about a question that we probably don't like to ask, and that question is, what else could happen? Because it's the kind of question that when it comes to faith and politics, as soon as you say what else could happen, you probably don't even have to wait 24 hours before something happens and you think, why did I even ask that question? We are in a very interesting moment when it comes to the political society. Think about it this way. 10 years ago, nobody would have thought that if you say you know what a Democrat is and what they stand for and what their coalitions are all going to be, and if you say the same thing about Republicans, no one would think that now those things are basically blown apart. Right? They've been all blown apart, and it's hard to know. The Democrats don't seem to really know what they're doing. The Republicans are kind of scrambling and trying to figure out what they're doing, and there's a lot of confusion out there. Now, what's also characteristic of this time, there's a lot of distress. For some people, there's despair about politics. And certainly, a lot of things that happen that make people roll their eyes one more time. And here's the thing I want to say that's probably counterintuitive about everything I just said. This is actually one of the greatest moments for Christian political engagement. It may seem the opposite because of all what you might call the madness, but it is actually one of the greatest times. And hopefully by the time I'm done, you'll see why I say that. Now, one of the things that I want to do at the beginning is talk about how we got here, at least when it comes to those people that are called evangelical Christians. So I teach at Wheaton, which is an evangelical institution, and there have been many conversations that I've had with students and with others ever since the last presidential election, and people have a lot of confusion and they're sort of ill at ease about the word evangelical, and certainly about the relationship of evangelicals to politics. Sometimes all you need to know about the curiosity or the vexation or the distress that people have about evangelicals and politics is just to say the phrase, the 81%. You know what I mean when I say the 81%? As in 81% of people who identify as white evangelicals voted for our current president. And there are a lot of people who think that the 81% stands for basically all evangelicals. And it's wrong, but a lot of people, that's what they think it is, and they're confused about how you can have these people who seem to be these evangelicals who are connected to this president and his behavior. And they think, because of this 81% and because of their connection to the president, that they know what evangelicals have always thought about politics. Well, let me tell you a little story that will help clarify why it's not as simple as people may think just when they hear a phrase like 81%. So the story begins by saying this. Once upon a time, the word fundamentalist was not a bad word. It was not a bad word. I mean, if you call me a fundamentalist now, or I call you a fundamentalist now, chances are your response, if I call you a fundamentalist, is like, no, I'm not. Or if you call me a fundamentalist, I'll say, look at my music collection, definitely not. So, I mean, because it has a negative connotation, right? Being militant in rhetoric, being very convinced that you're right and that other people are wrong, and being probably pretty anti-intellectual. But there was a time when that word fundamentalist did not mean any of those things. The word fundamentalist is associated with a series of pamphlets that emerged between 1910 and 1920 called the Fundamentals. Those pamphlets were about writing about the fundamentals of faith, things like the truthfulness of the Bible, the virgin birth of Jesus, the sacrificial death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. Those types of things about the physical return of Jesus at the end of history, those basic fundamental beliefs were what were in those pamphlets. Those pamphlets were produced because people were reacting to developments in scholarship that had questioned the authenticity of what we would call traditional Christian beliefs. So there are people who wanted to shore up those Christian beliefs by talking about the things that were fundamental to Orthodox Christianity, hence producing the fundamentals. Now, the people who identified with this were Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians. I mean, a whole bunch of people who might have differences about whether you baptize babies or not, but they agreed about these fundamentals. So those people were called fundamentalists, and it was an identity that had to do with their commitment to the fundamentals, even if they had differences in denominational identity. So go into the 1920s, and you have in what we now call our mainline denominations something that was called the fundamentalist modernist controversies. So I just told you who fundamentalists are. Modernists were those people who were basically espousing those developments in scholarship about the Bible. And the question was, who's going to control these mainline denominations? Who's going to get the pulpits in the most influential churches? Who are going to be the people that are teaching in the seminaries and giving leadership to those seminaries? So you had this controversy. The fundamentalists lose that controversy. So by the end of that decade, one of these that happens around 1929, a guy named J. Gresham Machen leaves Princeton Theological Seminary and goes to start something that he wants to be a seminary that's like old Princeton, and you get the emergence of what's called Westminster Theological Seminary. So Machen leaves the mainline, starts his own seminary. Now, Machen's an outlier in some ways because what other fundamentalists do is they leave mainline denominations, various Baptists and Presbyterian ones, for example, and they basically circle the wagons and start their own world. Now, in their own world, they pretty much withdraw from society, right? So no longer would you tell your kids, hey, it's a great idea to try to, when you're done with high school, to go to an Ivy League school. You stay away from such apostate institutions. So you get the emergence of withdrawal from society, militant rhetoric, and in some ways making a virtue of being anti-intellectual. And in this withdrawal from society, it also included this interesting thing. On the one hand, fundamentalists were definitely people who wanted to be patriotic, but because of this withdrawal from the world, don't you dare think about running for office. Don't you dare think about being involved in the political process itself. So don't participate in politics except maybe to vote, but don't get in the game of politics because it's worldly to get into the game. And some fundamentalists went so far as to make a virtue out of what is called separation. In other words, you're not truly a fundamentalist unless you come out and be separate from those that are not fundamentalists. And then you had other fundamentalists who practice what's called second-degree separation, which is you separate from other Christians because they haven't separated from people that you think are apostate. Okay? So it's an interesting thing. Read about that sometime. But the important thing to note is that they've withdrawn from participation into these institutions and societies, particularly political ones. Fast forward to the 1940s. Some fundamentalists, like Harold John Ockenga, Carl F.H. Henry, and Billy Graham, not the only ones, but among the others, they are people who are definitely fundamentalists in that first sense that I talked about. Okay, so they believe the fundamentals, but they are not so excited about this being withdrawn from society. They're not so excited about this being anti-intellectual. So what do? They begin the emergence of what we now call the evangelical movement, which is basically fundamentalists who decided to get more engaged, at least intellectually, in society. So, for example, Carl F.H. Henry, he's got 2 PhDs. right? So, or he had 2 PhDs because he's no longer with us. But they wanted to say, we can hold to the fundamentals, but we can also be very engaged intellectually with like the brightest minds of the time. So they wanted to be intellectually engaged, but they actually tended to remain politically removed. Now, it's true that in 1947, Carl F. H. Henry wrote a book that's very well known called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, where he was worried about this withdrawal from society, and because this withdrawal included withdrawing from social engagement and caring and ministry to the poor, etc. Now, the interesting thing about Henry's book is that it's famous because he wrote it. It's not famous because it was persuasive, because it wasn't persuasive. So it's notable that he wrote it because he was concerned about it, but he was not successful in convincing people that they should re-engage in things like politics. So people are still staying out of the game of politics. So fast forward to the 1970s. I know I skipped a couple of decades there because things were basically the same in terms of political engagement. But then in the 1960s, you begin to get a couple of court decisions, culminating in a court decision in the early 70s, where people start to worry that the government is interfering with the lives of religious people. The decision that winds up pushing some of these now evangelical people into political life is the decision where Bob Jones loses its tax-exempt status because of its approach to dating, which was that they didn't allow interracial dating. So then you get some evangelicals who now decide they have to get politically involved because the government is beginning to impinge upon their religious life. Now, a lot of times when people tell the story about evangelicals and politics from the 70s until this moment, people say evangelicals got involved in politics because of the passing of Roe versus Wade. It is true that by the middle of the 1970s that they did get involved. They did care about the abortion issue, but that was not the first issue that got them involved in politics. It was the Bob Jones decision that got them involved. Interesting thing about the 1970s, 1976, Time and Newsweek label 1976 the year of the evangelical. They call it the year of the evangelical because who's president in 1970s? Who gets elected? Jimmy Carter. And when people are interviewing Jimmy Carter and they ask him about himself, you know, you have this Georgia peanut farmer who becomes president who also teaches Sunday school. And when you ask him about his religious faith, he says he's born again. And so people are like, what is this born again business? And all this conversation about people being born again gives attention to the commitment to Christian conversion that's associated with evangelical believers. So 76 becomes the year of the evangelical. Now remember, Carter's a Democrat and he gets elected, and that makes it the year of the evangelical. By 1980, you get a reversal of that. Now, around 1980, you get the emergence of the moral majority and someone like Jerry Falwell, who still even then identifies as a fundamentalist. So he was an atypical fundamentalist by wanting to get involved politically. And some other fundamentalists thought he had fallen off the fundamentalist wagon because he did this. But you start the moral majority because of concerns about the direction of society. And so he wants to be very involved politically. Well, what also happens in 1980 is many of these people who might have been excited about Carter soured on him, and they get behind Reagan. So if you start thinking, if I say evangelicals and politics, and you go, oh, people who are definitely going to vote Republican, it hasn't always been that way. Right? It really begins to become that way from Reagan onward. But here's something you have to know, that even though Reagan gets elected and there are evangelicals who are supporting him and they're excited about that involvement, moral majority types, for example, many evangelicals are not yet on board with this political engagement. They're not sure it's what Christians should be doing. They fear it's too worldly. Even though in 84 and 88, Pat Robertson runs for president. So yes, some evangelicals are excited about this. There's still a lot of evangelicals. I'm not so sure we should be doing this. It's actually not until The late 1990s, where you get anything like a consensus among evangelicals that they ought to be definitely involved in politics. So what starts happening by the late 90s, all of a sudden you start seeing all these articles about, yes, we should be involved in Hollywood. Yes, we should be involved in Capitol Hill. Yes, let's get out there and have that kind of engagement. That's how recent it is when you talk about anything like the majority of evangelicals thinking that it's proper to be involved with politics. Now, who gets elected in 2000? George W. Bush, Bush the Younger, as I like to say. His White House is notable for a number of people that identify as evangelicals being part of his White House staff, including perhaps the best known person is, this person was a speechwriter for him, Michael Gerson. So in his White House, and in terms of his own story, there's an attention to evangelicals and politics, and one of the things you start to see is the media trying to figure out, who are all these evangelicals? And since they're so involved in the White House now, let's try to interpret these people. And so here's how you know the media is probably not doing a good job of researching this. They're not asking my former colleague Mark Knoll who evangelicals are. They're asking Joel Osteen about what evangelicals are. He didn't do a particularly good job of explaining it. So, but the point is that, you know, people think, oh, there's a prominent person that kind of identifies with evangelicals. Let's ask him about who evangelicals are and what they care about. So that's kind of the way it went in terms of what was happening in the public perception. Now, what was also happening in that decade from 2000 to 2010, younger evangelicals were starting to care about not just issues of abortion and gay marriage, but also issues about poverty and the environment. So there was a younger generation that cared about these traditional issues, but also cared about more. They wanted to expand what those public concerns were. Now, irrespective of the generation, the thing is that what also happens between 2000 and 2010, the Iraq War happens. And a lot of things that evangelicals are hoping for that will be achieved through political means, not a lot of those things move forward. And people start to wonder, well, should we have been doing this to begin with? By 2012, there's even a lot of people, whether evangelicals or not, people are just wondering, well, should we be involved in politics or not? Because after all, aren't PACs just going to buy the election? So, parenthetical statement here. There are PACs on the left and there are PACs on the right. Billionaires on the left, billionaires on the right. Only one side wins. So somebody's PAC, some billionaires are losing. So the idea that PACs are buying the election is, it's a great story. It doesn't, work out because all PACs aren't successful. So we set aside that kind of fear and cynicism about the way that political process works out. Well, so you have ambivalence, though people have gotten engaged, ambivalence about politics among evangelicals from the time of George W. Bush, or later in the George W. Bush presidency, through the Obama presidency, and then we get to this election. This vexing election which it shouldn't surprise you that, that Trump got the nomination in this sense. You had 19 people vying for the Republican nomination. Now, even George Pataki, and I don't know why he was doing that, but he did. And Trump was very good at making it all about him. And here's the thing, that once he got the nomination, and you got Hillary Clinton, here's the thing that he did. He went to some evangelical leaders and he asked them for what they wanted. And they said, we want you to be, to sort of put the brakes on what's happening with sexuality. We want the Supreme Court. We want you to be, caring about what we care about with abortion. We want smaller government, this kind of thing. He said, okay, I'll give you that, all right? Hillary Clinton's campaign did not meet with evangelicals. it's not until the August before her election that the people on her staff even begin to think that maybe they should think about religious people. My friend Michael Weir, who worked in the Obama White House, he will tell you that if you looked on Hillary Clinton's website, what you saw was, or what you didn't see, was anywhere people of faith could go to see how Hillary Clinton cared about their concerns. Because the people that were running her campaign actually thought, we don't need evangelicals. We don't need religious people, right? We're going to win. She lost. Now, when it came to the election itself, evangelicals had to decide, am I going to vote for Hillary Clinton, who's ignored us, and who many of them think, because a lot of these evangelicals were Republicans and not big fans of Obama and thinking she's going to be more of the same or worse. Am I going to vote for her and get more of the same, or am I going to vote for him? And so, of the people who voted, 81% of white evangelicals, because not all evangelicals are white, by the way, like, not all evangelicals are white, like I said, but 81% of those who voted for Donald Trump. Now, please understand this about this 81% number, okay? What percentage of the electorate didn't vote? 40%. Okay? Now, no one's talked about who of that 40% are evangelicals. So whatever you think about the 81%, right, is not actually 81% of all evangelicals. Right? It's 81% of those who voted out of the 60% of people that voted, and 81% out of white evangelicals who voted, and then 81% of people who said they were evangelical just because it was the category that somebody asked them as they were leaving the polls. So it's a complicated thing to think about that kind of evangelical identity. It was a difficult election, okay? Now, another complicated problem we have, for sure, is there are people, such as Jerry Falwell Jr., Robert Jeffress, Franklin Graham, people are identifying as evangelicals, and they're getting lots of attention because of their consistent support for the president. And the assumption is that because of their voices, that somehow this is speaking for all evangelicals. Not exactly, I think, but that's the way that it's playing. That's the way it's playing among lots of people. All right, so it's created certainly distress about, well, what should we do? What should evangelicals do in this moment? And how much should we care about politics? So here's what I want to say. The name of my lecture is Faithful Politics. That kind of tells you that I already think we ought to be involved in politics. But I am not so naive to think that just because I tell you that we should do it, that you're convinced. So let me try to convince you as to why we ought to be involved in politics. So, should Christians be involved in political life? Yes, is my answer. Why is yes my answer? It goes back to the beginning. It goes back to the first page of the Bible. Now, I'm one of these people who's very influenced by what people talk about in Genesis 1:26 and 28, what some people call the creation mandate or the cultural mandate, where when God says about creating humans in Genesis 1:26, says, let us make man in our image, male and female, but it then says, and let them rule over the creation. All right? And then 28, God blesses them, multiplies, says, be fruitful and multiply, have dominion over my creation. Part of this idea of dominion, and please let me understand, by dominion what that means, it does not mean do whatever you want in God's creation. What it means is God gives humans the responsibility for managing life in his creation and leading it to its flourishing. That's the point. So whenever you think about dominion, think about it this way. If I ask you what you call someone who is a ruler over something, and they rule poorly, versus someone who rules well, what do you say about the difference between those two people? It's not the fact that they have the role of a ruler, it's how well they stewarded the role of being a ruler. So the point then is, humans are given this dominion, this ruling role in God's creation, and humans ought to rule it well. To rule it well includes what we call political life. Now, I know some people, they think, but politics just really is distasteful to me. So let me try to redefine politics for you. Think about politics as how we together manage our life so that it's not just about the good for me, but it's also about the good for you. And we together think about how do we manage our life together so that we facilitate, so we make possible the flourishing of all people. That's what it is at its best. And then there's this fact about how we go about doing that. Most of it is not particularly exciting. Most of it is very mundane management. I mean, think about it this way. Have you ever wondered how in a town that had a stop sign that they wound up having a stoplight instead of having a stop sign? It didn't happen because an inventor showed up and sold everybody on something called a stoplight and everybody decided to get one. Chances are it happened because a stop sign alone in that town with an increasing population created problems for traffic flow, and they had to decide how they're going to navigate that traffic flow. So people get together to answer that question and to decide what they're going to do. So somebody decides that we don't need a stop sign anymore. We need more lanes, and we need these things called traffic lights, right? And then we need to find out who's going to pay for those, who's going to manage those. And how are we going to have a revenue stream for that? Taxes, right? I mean, so the point is, that's politics. Life together in this world. Now, sure, it also includes things, it extends to things like foreign policy. Of course it does. It extends to questions about what you think about abortion and sexuality, etc. But most of politics is a very long game that involves taking lots of time figuring out what are the best ways to come up with policies from the town level to the national level, and people spend time devising policy, and then they finally propose that policy, and then people take votes on those things, and then people think about implementing and executing those policies. That's how politics works. Here's, unfortunately, how most evangelical Christians think about it. They think about it as in, I'm not sure anything is going on. I just take everything for granted. Wait, there's an emergency. I need to now pay attention because there's an emergency because somebody told me there's an emergency, and now I need to maybe call somebody about an issue I'm concerned about. The rest of the time, I ignore it. In other words, people treat politics like they treat, the fire company. I know you're there. I ignore you. I don't even want to look at you until my house is on fire. So in other words, politics for many people is essentially crisis management. But the fact is politics is going on all the time that has nothing to do with managing the latest crisis. Of course, politics attends to crisis, but it's a whole lot more than about the latest crisis. And there are people all the time at work engaging those things. And that work is that is one expression of what it is for Christians to obey this dominion mandate. Now, here's an important thing that qualifies what I just said. The way I just talked about it assumes the republic that we live in the United States of America. I am not assuming that this is how politics works if you're in North Korea or Saudi Arabia. You know Saudi Arabia, right? Our ally that's also a totalitarian state, right? They're our friends, okay, but they just allowed women to start driving in Saudi Arabia. So, if you're in Saudi Arabia and you are a Christian, okay, your political participation is very different, perhaps non-existent. It's obviously non-existent if you're in North Korea, right? It's different if you're in France, where like 0.1% of the population is Christian and it's very secular as a virtue, okay? Those are all different contexts where political life will work out differently. We are in a context where it is possible. I mean, this is the narrative. It often feels more like mythology than true narrative, but let's just say, here's what the narrative is. The narrative is that any of you, people who, one day, you too can be president of the United States. I mean, that's the narrative of the United States. A citizen can be a participant in government all the way up to the highest office in the land, if you're a citizen. Okay, that's in the United States. That is not all countries. Okay? In the United States, that is part of, at least in theory, what's possible. And I will say, for sure, you can easily get involved in politics right now. Whatever your political party is, call your local office. They've got work for you to do. You can easily get involved in politics. You can easily get involved in the work of what a party is doing. It is not hard. And you can wind up at some point running for office yourself. At the town level, the state level, at the national level. That's possible for any citizen in the United States. So it's with the assumption of that kind of polity that I'm talking about, the fact that here's an opportunity for Christians to manage life in God's world and orienting it towards flourishing by participating in that political world. Now, I'm not saying everybody needs to run for office. I am saying everybody should vote. I will say that for sure. But the point is that I'm trying to make the case now that with the way that God has given humans the opportunity to manage his world, politics is one of those ways we manage the world. I mean, it's one of those expressions. So it's there for us. Now, somebody might say, well, you're only talking about page 1. What about page 3? You know what happens on page 3, don't you? Dr. Bacote, you are a theology professor after all, I think. The fall happens on page 3. The curse happens on page 3. You're right, it does. Do you know what else happens with the enunciation of the curse? God never says, forget it and just run for your lives until I send you a Savior. Even in the announcement of the curse, he talks about that there's going to be pain in childbearing, that there's going to be labor in working the fields. You know what God doesn't say? You're going to have pain in childbirth, but every birth is going to be a stillbirth. You're going to work the ground, and it's only going to be weeds. You will have zero fruitfulness. That's not what he says. You have pain in childbirth, but you will have childbirth. You will have children. You will have the sweat of your brow. Work now becomes labor, and now, yes, you get weeds, thorns, and thistles, but you still get fruitfulness from your work. So now, what I've just talked about in terms of our responsibility for God's world, it's become more complicated, but it has not become an impossibility. And it has not been vetoed, right? No circle and slash around this. God said, yeah, I meant it, but forget it. No, God said, it's still your opportunity, still your responsibility. It just got a lot harder. It just got a lot complicated. But the opportunity itself remains. So, for us, in this country, Christians have the opportunity, really, I would say the responsibility, to be political actors, to be politically engaged. It's one thing that is proper to being a human being in God's world. It's not the only thing. There are many other things, but it's one of them. And here's the thing. Let's say that someone says, yeah, but I've heard about so many negative things about politics, and it got so complicated in recent years, and not a lot of good things have happened. So let's say I agree with you. So here's the thing I would say about that. So evangelicals have basically had something like a consensus about politics for maybe 20 years. And you think, because you got involved in politics 20 years ago, when other people have been involved for a long time, and you decided to get involved in the game, and now because you got involved in the game, it's complicated for things to work out according to the way you hope it would work out. Okay, that's assuming that nobody else was ever involved. But they are involved. And if you decide because it got hard, I want to check out of it, then all I would like to say is, please don't complain when other people drive the bus of politics and take it in a direction you don't want it to go. Because you said, I'm just going to ride. I'm not going to be involved. Which means you're saying to other people, please, you drive wherever you want to go, and I'll be happy with it. Right? So that's what people are saying if they check out. You're saying, oh, I'll let you do it. So if you want to let other people do it, just be aware they are going to do it. Because there's some people who will say, oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And then they will take the direction of politics wherever they want to go because other people checked out. So to check in means now you're part of the process, but other people are there too, and you have to learn to work with them. You have to have a lot of patience. You have to recognize that this is a long game. A long, long, long game. And political change, most of it takes a long time. Some things happen fast, but not most things. So I think our perspective, sometimes our assumptions about political change are just false because we think that it should, if somebody gets elected, everything ought to change overnight. Very rare. Very rare for that to happen. So we ought to be engaged, but patient and steady at the wheel through the peaks and valleys of political life. Now, so that's sort of trying to make the case for being engaged. But okay, once you get engaged, there's still something that we need to do, especially in this moment that we're in, about our disposition. My former colleague, Alan Jacobs, he's written recently about the fact that, we are a very agitated society right now. Right? I mean, chances are that some of you are a little bit agitated, about what's going on politically. And maybe you feel like, I just don't know that I can talk to anybody about anything political because why? Because the room is going to blow up if I say anything political. I was saying earlier today, I recall in the last 3 months, hearing a group of conservative students at Wheaton say, well, I can't really talk about what I really think because I think more of Wheaton is progressive. And then hearing progressive students saying, yeah, well, why should I even say about what I think? Because most of Wheaton is really conservative. And I'm like, okay, now which one is it? Is it conservative or is it, progressive? Well, probably not either as extreme as either one of them things. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting if you just had the courage to actually have a conversation with each other? Right? And I think it's really important. This will be an opportunity to show our agitated, divided society a better way. And here's, I think, a key to doing that. So when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandments in the law, the second of the greatest commandments, he says, is to love your neighbor as yourself. So here's what I wonder. What if Christians really took that seriously when it came to all of their discourse politically? Love your neighbor as yourself. So here's part of what that would mean in this society, particularly where people have differing opinions. When it comes to people who have different opinions than you, ask yourself this question. If someone disagrees with me, what do I want them to say about me? Do I want them to lie about me? Do I want them to assume they already know everything about me just because they know one thing about an opinion I have about something political? Do I want them to assume they know everything about me and then to relate to me being certain that they know that one thing about me and I'll just take it? I don't think anybody would say, you know what I love? I love when people tell me stuff about myself that they've assumed about me because they know one thing about me. I love it. Please talk to me that way because I love it. It's fantastic. Right? I don't think anybody wants to say, I just enjoy being lied on. I enjoy being misunderstood. No one likes that. And the point is this: are you willing to say, all right, am I willing to actually ask somebody what they think about a lot of things, and what they care about, and what they're fearful about, and what they hope for? Am I willing to ask them about that, and to be informed and to trust and believe what they tell me, instead of just assuming I know the answer to those questions already? Am I willing to do that? And am I hoping that they are going to do the same thing for me? Think about it this way. If somebody you converse with, you think that they are wrong about 99%, right? My question is this: are you willing to go to the mat to say, but you better believe they're absolutely right about 1%? Or are you so content with them being wrong about 99% that you will not tell the truth about that 1%? Now, if you love your neighbors yourself, you will go to the mat for that 1%. And you will say, we completely disagree, like, about almost everything. But there's a sliver, you see. And man, they're absolutely right about that. And I will not let anybody lie on them about that. I refuse to do that. Because if they disagree with me, and there was 1% that they agree with about me, I don't think I would want them to say, yeah, and who cares about that part? I want them to tell the truth about me. I mean, this is really love your neighbor 101. Tell the truth about everyone, even the people that disregard you, even the people that you disagree with, the people you think are very wrong. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to actually be in a space with someone with whom you disagree? And to actually have a humanizing conversation together where you say, okay, perhaps here's a way we can do this. Let's lay labels aside, first of all. Conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, progressive or reactionary, etc. And let's just talk and get to know each other. Let's seriously ask questions about what we care about. And let's find out why one approach or another politically I find compelling or they find compelling. Even if we disagree in the end, even if we're not in the same place. But at least we were actually willing to be present with each other together and to honor each other as human beings. To honor each other as neighbors, rather than saying, the only people I treat as neighbors are people who live in the same echo chamber in which I live. I think that's a very, very important thing about the current disposition. Why are people so agitated? They assume that the other person, it's almost like they assume they're not really human. They're a monster. And I can't take the chance of treating a monster like a neighbor. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people, they're thinking the same thing about you, perhaps. So, at least Christians ought to be characterized as people who say, you know what? It's not even necessarily politically expedient to do this. But commitment to God requires me to love my neighbor as myself. And to say, I will never put an asterisk beside neighbor. If you are a divine image bearer, you are my neighbor. If you are my neighbor, then I am seeking for you what I am seeking for myself. And I want to be as truthful about you as I hope you'll be truthful about me. If people were willing to have those kinds of conversations and to model that, they might discover there's so much we disagree with, but man, I really like this person. They're just cool. I'll never vote like they vote. I'll never espouse what they espouse. But we love to go bowling together because we just really get on. We have all these differences, but because we actually decided to be human together, we discovered that we could actually live together. Now, that would be something if Christians were on the leading edge with a disposition like that. People would say, what are these people doing? How are they doing that? Aren't they worried? The current moment would lead people to say that. But what the response can be is, well, I decided to actually pay attention to what Jesus says about neighbors. And because I did, I then remembered that my neighbors aren't just people that agree with me. And I thought I should get to know my neighbors. And when I got to know my neighbors, I discovered they're not so bad. Now, parenthetical statement. Could it backfire with someone? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But here's the thing. Your obedience to the second greatest commandment isn't determined by whether it ever backfires. It's determined by your allegiance to Jesus. If you have allegiance to him, the fact that it backfires once or twice doesn't mean you give it up. You say, I will keep doing this. And I would wager, I'm not a betting man, but I would wager that most of the people would be pleasantly surprised that you gave them the time of day to actually listen to what they cared about. Because people are so agitated now, it's like they're afraid to listen to what people care about. And, particularly the students here, if you have dissonance with your parents right now about what's going on politically, call your parents tonight or tomorrow and say, I know we're not on the same page, but you know what I'd like to know? I'd like to know what you really care about. I'd like to know what you're afraid of. I'd like to know what you hope for. And I'd like to tell you what I care about, and what I'm afraid about, and what I hope for, and what I wonder about, and what I'm confused about. I mean, we need more of those kinds of conversations instead of conversations where everybody is so certain that they know everything about the other person. None of us does. None of us does. None of us does. If that was our disposition, what a difference that makes in terms of our witness. I also want to say something here at the end about addressing a public concern. And it's a major public concern. And it's one example of politics I want to talk about. And then I promise I'll wrap it up. I told him about certain things that I was going to do in like certain periods of time. And thank you for not like flashing how many minutes I went past that. But so I want to talk about the perpetual lingering challenge of race. And here's one of the reasons why I'm doing that. When I first started teaching at Wheaton, I was like, you know what I'm not talking about? I'm not talking about race. And I'm not talking about race because I don't want people to think, well, of course he's going to talk about race. Therefore, don't talk about it. Surprise people say, hey, did you know I can talk about all this other stuff besides race? There are other topics other than race that I can talk about. But here's the thing that I can. But here's the thing I discovered, which is that if I don't talk to my students about race, I am part of a conspiracy of silence. And I don't help anybody to think better about race if I'm silent about race. And if I don't help people to think about how do we move forward on this. So what should we do? Well, first, just like I said, have the courage to talk to your neighbor. Have the courage to really look at the problem of race. And the first thing I'd like to say about that actually is, don't assume you have omniscience about the problem of race in the modern West. I mean, honestly, I defy anybody, including myself in here, to say that they do. I really do. Because there's a lot to it. There are libraries about this stuff. And most of us don't know all of that library. So we need to have the mindset of a learner. But when you're going to have that mindset of a learner, you also have to have incredible courage. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the film 12 Years a Slave, but there's a scene in 12 Years a Slave that's an example of the kind of mindset you have to have if you're going to deal with this. It's called the whipping scene, where a slave named Missy gets beat by her master. And what Steve McQueen, the director, does is he does what's called a long take, which means the camera is there. And he's there while she's getting beat and screaming for the entire whipping that she gets. And I don't know how long it lasts, but it feels like it lasts 10 minutes. And you hear a lash and a scream, and a lash and a scream, and it just gets worse and worse. And you want to run out of the theater. You don't want to look at it. Steve McQueen was asked, why did you do that? And he said, I don't want to let the audience off the hook, is what he said. And very often when it comes to the question of race, people want to get off the hook. That's what they want to do. Because if you look at it, okay, it's a horror story. And it's a horror story that we are still dealing with. It's as if somebody dropped an asteroid in Lake Michigan, besides, near where I live. And when an asteroid, if it hit the ground, it would be really bad. But if it did, there'd be a huge splash, and everybody would know the splash. Right? That splash is like the introduction of this modern concept of race, with all the things that had to do with dehumanizing non-whites. Everybody knows about those things, and that happens. And now, of course, okay, Jim Crow's illegal, slavery's illegal. Okay, we're past those things. But, in physics, they say, if something lands like that, you've got the big waves at first and all that splash, but as time goes on, waves keep coming to the shore, right? Well, the waves are still coming to the shore from that asteroid with race. And we have to contend with that reality. And if you contend with that reality, you're going to see that there's multiple ways that it has affected people. Now, the fact that I'm standing up here and that you're actually listening to me, and many of you aren't looking at me, from what I can tell, like you would never believe, one, that I really got this PhD and that I'm trustworthy. I mean, that tells you that we've advanced. Okay? If this is Georgia 40 years ago, I'm not so sure you're looking at me this way. Okay? So that tells me we've advanced. None of that means that we've arrived on race. Advancement is nowhere close to arrival. I mean, you think about this. How long in the history of the United States has it been since African Americans can vote? Okay, right? Not a long time. How many years was it in terms of the history of the United States before that was legal? At least 200 years, right? Does anybody think that because we're 50 years past certain, because you can write something on ink in 50 years, that everything that you invested into the country for a couple of centuries, that it just stops? That it just goes away? No way. I wish, and I believe in miracles. But that's not the world we live in. There are still the effects economically, educationally, in terms of public health, in terms of law. I mean, we can just keep going. There are things that are better for people like myself, but there's still lots of things that we have to deal with. In fact, I like the way Henry Louis Gates put it, which basically said, it's possible that the civil rights movement was great if you were middle class or up as a African American. If you were poor, it hasn't really done anything for you. I mean, that's still part of the reality with which we have to contend. So the first thing you have to do is look at it. The second thing you have to do is recognize that it's actually okay for you to not feel like you can immediately fix it. Because none of us can immediately fix it. So we need to set aside what I call messianic pretensions about these things. There's one Messiah, and that's Jesus. None of us is the Messiah. Most of us, you will face that horror, and you will be immediately confronted with your incompetence to deal with it. That's okay. It's okay. Just admit it. It's fine. Then start asking questions. Then start getting to know people. Then start thinking about, when it comes to our political reality, what are the ways that we can attend to various dimensions of life that our political system, with which our political system is involved. How can I participate in moving things slowly? Because sometimes these things take time. Sometimes things happen fast, but generally, like I said, it goes slowly. How can I even begin moving things slowly on this? Whether it has to do with making education really more equal, with facilitating more access to capital for African Americans that want to be successful in business. Most places are not like Atlanta when it comes to African Americans in business. How are we going to help make that happen? How am I going to actually make it possible for people who are wealthy and African Americans to not still feel like they're outsiders on Wall Street? Because these are true realities. How am I going to help facilitate those things? And why am I going to do that? What would be my reason why? It's, at one level, part of loving your neighbor, and asking, how are other people not flourishing? Not just how am I a neighbor, but how are other people experiencing the opposite of being loved as a neighbor? And what are all the ways that happens for them individually and all the way to structural realities in our society? I'm asking that question. But it's also because, when Jimmy Carter was at his inauguration, what he quoted was from the book of Micah. Micah 6:8. He's shown you, oh man, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. If God wants his people to be people who are committed to justice, okay, they can never say we should stop talking about race. Whenever anybody says, and I can understand why sometimes people might ask the question, why do we have to keep talking about this? Why do we keep bringing it up? I've decided to start saying this. It wasn't African Americans that brought it up. It was Europeans that invented the concept of race and whiteness. They brought it up. And everybody that's non-white has been dealing with it ever since. So if you want to complain about who's bringing it up, look to the old country, okay? Because that's where it was invented. I mean, you ever wonder why when you think about words like white and black and stuff, how it doesn't really make sense when you actually look at people, right? I mean, people made up these things, right? And they married some things that were scientific with some things that were cultural and made up something called race. It's a social construct. So that social construct has been very successful. And it's so successful that it's like a mutating virus all the time. Whenever you think you've killed it, a new version arrives. And so we have to keep contending with that if we care about God saying that his people should be characterized by the pursuit of justice. And please understand, the pursuit of justice isn't about being a Democrat or being a Republican. It's about following God. Because God